welcome to One-to-One Mining Investment Cape Town. It's fantastic to be back here in this beautiful city. We're going to kick straight off with our leaders in investment, in mining investment panel, capital allocation in line with global decarbonisation goals. And we've got a fantastic lineup of panelists for you today. We have Henry Steele, who is portfolio manager at Odey Asset Management. We have Hans-Arne, who is head of metals and minerals at Clarksons. We have Cathy Nader, who is principal mining and resources, principal in mining and resources finance at Nedbank, and Paul Quirk, who is a partner at Lionhead Capital. And we should have Philip Clegg, who's portfolio manager from Orion Resource Partners. And we've got a wonderful lineup here. We've got about 50 minutes to talk about this theme. We're talking about, where we are in the cycle, but particularly with reference to the need to accelerate the development of metals projects essential for the energy transition. So, and also, particularly now, here we are in South Africa, how African countries can benefit. So maybe, I think we'll start here, Cathy, at this end. From a Nedbank point of view, you're based in Johannesburg. You're looking at financing projects across the continent. How do you see this theme unrolling out in 2023?
Thanks, Leo. So we're seeing a lot of investment coming into South Africa in particular and on the continent, specifically in battery minerals, energy transition minerals. But, our view with Africa cannot beneficiate these minerals. So there's a huge leakage of value that is leaving the continent, which is not great. Africa needs to sort out their baseload power, their infrastructure, in order to really benefit from this new capital allocation that's coming for global decarbonisation.
Paul, we were talking earlier a little bit about something Cathy just mentioned there. In Africa in particular, opportunities for companies maybe to use more solar and hydropower to develop greener projects as well?
Yeah, I think the benefit that we're seeing with Africa is that, from a sort of sustainability perspective, is the types of commodities that are available to mine here. You've got all the sort of battery metals, and as exploration spend increases, has started to increase over the last couple of years, I think that there's a huge amount of opportunity for the types of minerals that will help with the green energy transition. But also, I think from a sustainability perspective, there's a huge amount. To your point, it would be great to have the infrastructure required, but there is a huge opportunity to have solar and wind and other forms of energy to utilize on the mines themselves as well.
Absolutely. And Henry, coming to you. What are you doing in terms of your capital allocation looking at this theme?
Look, I think the brutal reality is it's a lot more difficult now than electrification. The energy transition is creating a lot more risk in the area, and in particular the IRA. We've obviously seen recently the announcement with General Motors. It's making things a lot more attractive to do business in the US. So the jurisdictional risk is generally less, but you've obviously got, from a fiscal perspective, it's incredibly supportive rather than a government trying to extract, it's trying to support. So the brutal reality is that one is going to see, and we're already seeing, particularly in Europe, and seeing the pushback by European companies of that capital being allocated into the US. So that's the kind of on the support side. With regards to just simply the project economics side, before even the fiscal take, the question from our side is really around this innovation risk. So, what a metal that may be or a commodity that may be a transition commodity, whether it's kind of cobalt, lithium, whatever it may be, what is the demand going to look like? The volume demand is going to look like in 10 years' time, when these projects start coming online, 7 to 10 years' time, and therefore the risk of investing if it's a startup project. So we're really moving much more towards producing assets rather than kind of development assets in this space. And where we are, on the kind of curve of that moving into production phase, we want to see very strong offtake contracts. We know that the volume commitment is there, and some sort of price linkage or pricing of the commodity, of the offtake, that we can have confidence in will be lasting life of mine, or whatever the returns are needed to kind of sustain that investment.
Philip, your thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that from an Orion perspective, the sort of decarbonisation agenda, as it is, has been something that we've been focusing on for really 5 or 6 years now, and we're very, very glad that we got ahead of it. Obviously, the thematic is not going anywhere anytime soon. It's going to remain with us. In actual fact, our LPs, it's the single thing that they want to talk about. And when you're in fundraising mode, because we have our own investors, you need to be cognizant of that. In terms of Africa itself, I would say there's pros and cons. I echo what Henry's saying, actually, in terms of the US being a relatively attractive place to invest, and it actually will be a centre for our investment. Same thing for Europe. But the problem with it is that projects are hard, right? They don't have a great track record of delivering projects on time and on budget, and the permitting risk is huge. You know, the time it takes from exploration to production is at least a decade. And that's not great. Africa actually has a better track record in that regard. Yes, there isn't much downstream, but actually the risk profile of what you're looking at, I think, is centered on different risks. It's geopolitical risks. In certain African countries, it's about know-how. In certain African countries, it's about infrastructure. But in terms of getting a project off the ground, from a permitting perspective, we find it quite constructive.
I mean, you've raised a very good point there, which is that everyone talks about the length of time it takes these projects to get going, and the permitting is the big bottleneck. As we're looking forward into a future where there are decarbonisation goals that should need to be hit, and the supply of energy metals that needs to be reached, we need to speed that up, don't we? What do governments need to do to sort of get out of the way and let the mining industry, produce the metals that we need? Hans?
Well, what we see is definitively that to get licenses is difficult, but I think the most important for all the governments is to be predictable. I'm not that worried if it takes 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, but that is a predictable process that everyone can rely on, and that if you tick the boxes, you get the license. I think that's important. For the juniors in Africa, I think they should go and learn a bit from the oil and gas industry. They should partner up with mid-sized to major companies and let them do the development and operation, but stick to hold their 40-50% ownership. Unfortunately, our investors sees too many single sponsor companies that is not delivering project at budget at that time because they don't have done it before. They build a new organization, which is very, very difficult, and it's hard to build a mining project. So I hope that you can see the larger companies comes in and help juniors to build, construct, and also operate mines, because they have done it multiple times before, and they can put 20 people that can do more or less copy-paste from other places. So I think that's what I like to see from juniors, and then it will be much easier to get them financing for their contributing part.
So you're saying that juniors should stick to exploration and let the majors actually build the projects?
Yeah, just to your point about timing, one of the conundrums that we're personally facing when we're looking at projects at the moment is I don't think the public markets have been very good for projects, because people are driving NPV and massive capex projects versus return on invested ROIC, a return on invested capital. And as a result, I mean, permitting is one of the delays, but the other thing that's taking, as you correctly said, this sort of decade-long gestation period is that the public markets has driven people to follow this sort of stigma of how, 10-year life of mine and stuff like that. And so my advice for Africa, and we've invested in a gold business in Africa, and we're really very much focused on return on invested capital and leaving some of the upside down the road. That allows you to do two things. It allows you to get into cash flow quicker, and hopefully, so you scale your project based on return of capital. it allows you to get into cash flow quicker, and the other thing is it leaves some of the value on the table past the 10 years. So you don't have to bring all the resource into the first 10 years. And thirdly, actually, you don't give 50% away to the banks. I do generally think that if African businesses were to focus more on the size of project that they're building and the return of capital, people would invest more because you could get your money back quicker rather than focusing on the NPV of the asset.
Cathy, the banks, they shouldn't be giving away their value to the banks. Thoughts on that?
You know, that's a very interesting point. You know, we actually see that commercial banks are the cheapest form of debt. You know, they might take longer to put those types of financings into place. But, you know, our view is that the alternative financiers are where the value gets taken away.
That's also a very interesting point. I would counter that because I would say that actually when you're thinking about financing a project, the most important thing is to get it done, right? You've got to get it done. And actually I would argue a symbiotic relationship between the banks and financiers like ourselves. We work alongside each other all the time. And I think it's important that we have a number of financing solutions available to the sector because there is a dearth of capital. There was a wonderful presentation that was done by Glencore recently, which showed in the copper market how much of a deficit there is in terms of committed capital to not just exploration but expansion of copper assets. And they see over the course of the next 8 years to 2030, the copper market needs to be, there's a deficit of twice the annual consumption of copper right now. And there is no capital available for it. And to the bank's point, this is not a Nedbank point, but there are certain European banks that are actually retreating from the sector right now. In fact, they have gone. Right? There is no more project finance available from certain European banks at a time when we actually need it, and at a time where finally, you know, we are actually sexy as an industry.
What's scaring them away? Because obviously the business model is absolutely there. We need more copper. What's scaring them away?
The reason is actually quite simple. Because if you want to make LIBOR +5, you can make it in a manufacturing company of sort of hydrogen electrolyzers or a battery manufacturing company. You don't need to go to mining.
I think I would also add, you know, to kind of add to the full suite of opinions here, you know, as an investor in producing assets, which the vast amount of capital in the space is invested in that area, we're constantly saying to companies, the producers, don't expand supply. We don't want to see that new supply coming online because that's what crushes price. So to your question of, you know, permitting, timeline on permitting, do we really think it's, for us, cynically, as an investor in producing assets, do we want to see that shortened? Not really. We don't want to see that all that new supply come onto the market and fill that gap. What that gap means is higher prices and higher returns for the investors in the producing assets. And then I would also add, look, you know, there are some examples where, you know, it's exactly the point around ticking the boxes. That I think that makes a lot of sense. But one doesn't want to, you know, when there have been examples of governments or local communities effectively being steamrolled over by these companies in some cases, that can create a lot of issues, social issues, or, you know, other different types of stakeholder issues. There is a reason why that permitting process is there. It's not just to create a headwind for the developers. It's, to a large extent, a good reason. So I think one of the, to kind of circle back, I think, look, the vast majority of capital invested in the mining space is saying to the producers, don't bring on new supply. And so that capital just isn't around. They don't want to see that because the returns are made from price response rather than through volume.
I think that the debate about banks or different financings is important. Unfortunately, we do see exactly what Philip is mentioning. There is very few banks that cross the white line for financing a project in these days. And what we have seen important is that there are alternative financing with direct lenders or with a bond market, which get the money there, get the project done, and then when it's coming into production and stable production, well, then it can refinance in banks, which is much more inexpensive, I agree. But we have, I think now done construction financing for the last 3 years, and it's all for companies that don't get across the line with the banks. Everyone believes that they're going to have LIBOR plus 500 or even lower, and they work 1 and 2 and 3 years with the banks and can't cross the line. Then they come to us and we help them and advise them to get the money to build the projects. And that have been in Europe, it have been in Africa, and it have been in the US and also Australia. So even Canada, Australia, which is the mining countries of the world, the banks are not there.
Agreed, 100%. You know, there's definitely been banks withdrawing from the sector. Nedbank, we've been around for a long time through the cycle, but we're finding that we have less and less commercial banks to partner with, and we are partnering with alternative financiers. You know, I think what's important for us, going back to the topic of projects in Africa, we really want to see projects where the management team is not there on a speculative basis. They really need to have a commitment to get into first production. And that's another important aspect that we look for investing in these projects.
And the answer to that is yes, and all our investors look at the same. If our investors sort of sniff that this management team is going to flip a project, no, they don't want to be a part of it. They want to be people that can take it into production. But I want to address another question, which I think is very important for African projects. And just a couple of days ago, it comes out a book called Cobalt Red. And it's a pretty bad story about DRC and cobalt and so on. Rightly or wrongly, I think there still are a huge sort of perception and reputation risk for being involved in Africa. And I think that all the mining companies that are going to be sustainable and bring projects have to work a lot to be convincing and protecting investors for that risk. Because, you know, you cannot come in New York and tell that you have leakage of something happening and children work and so on. So I think that that reputation risk is extremely important for a project in Africa today.
Definitely. And moving into that sort of discussion about ESG principles, do we need to see the discussion needing to change to maybe broaden out to the overall sort of global impact of the energy transition rather than focusing on these individual projects? Henry, mentioned that you need to get the local support, the communities and all that sort of stuff. And absolutely, everyone would support that. But if a project is being held up and then might slow down the energy transition, the adoption of EVs or something, because of these local issues, it might affect things on a global scale. So what do people think about that?
So, okay, that was a long question. But I would just say that ESG, I've always said this, it's top of the list for us and it has been for many, many years, but it is ever evolving. And so the challenges that we face as an industry from an ESG perspective are changing year by year by year, and we need to evolve and react to that. So for us as investors, we're trying to position ourselves as a blue chip investor in the space. And so ESG is essentially non-negotiable. And it's quite interesting. I sat on a pitch battle recently, and there was a company that was presenting itself in Latin America, and it had a big problem with artisanal mining. And I asked the CEO the question, so could you just explain to me, what is your ESG framework here? How do you manage those risks? And his response was, ES what? Unbelievable. So people still aren't really on top of it. But for us as an organization, I think that we've done two things over the course of the last few years to try and evolve to this risk. I think the first thing is you've got to know what you're talking about. You need to get it right. And so for us, we appointed Robin Weissman as an independent member of our investment committee. Robin was a senior executive at the World Bank, the IFC. She basically wrote the performance standards, and so she keeps us in check. We also have an ESG manager who's dedicated to ensure that when we do our diligence, we do it right from an ESG perspective, and then when we make our investments, she helps our portfolio companies get it right. And the second thing is, I think you, as an investor, if you're going to expect your portfolio companies and potential investments to manage ESG correctly, you have to hold yourself accountable as well. And so for us, that's very important. We're members of the Principles for a Responsible Investment, and we have a whole swathe of things that we focus on from a sustainability perspective. So we do that holding ourselves accountable.
Can I just take the other side of the table on that one? I think the way that we would see it is our job isn't to bring new supply onto the market as an investors. That's not our job. Our job is to maximize the return for our shareholders and to do that in a way that's kind of sustainable, and ESG is part of that. And I don't think for us, ESG, there was any sort of change with ESG. I think the mining companies, a good mining company 40, 50, 60 years ago was looking at all the different stakeholders and making sure those different stakeholders were aligned. And that's always been part of our due diligence process to ensure that that's the case. So, the way that we kind of see the energy transition is it's creating a lot of opportunity, particularly in the old industry. These old industries haven't died. They're going to still be around for a long time. There is an energy transition, and during that transition, there are going to be great returns all over the place. Now, if everyone's deserting one particular area, thermal coal, and everyone hates it, no one wants to touch it, and yet demand outstrips supply, for example, in that one, we're going to have blockbuster returns for a very long period of time. And where in the energy transition is this? Is it in oil refining? Is it in thermal coal? How does met coal fit into that? So there are lots of different things to be thinking about. The energy transition doesn't necessarily need to be kind of the future, what may be electric vehicles or electrification stories. There is a huge amount of opportunity, and the return potential is significantly higher, we're seeing, in the traditional, let's say, commodities. They are producing, and from an ESG point of view, a lot of these assets and mines are in areas where there's very high unemployment. They create a huge amount of benefits to the local society. They may be much higher quality coals than the dirtier coals are displacing. So we'll move on to how we think about thermal coal in a minute. But I think there is a lot of opportunity from an investor's point of view in the energy transition, not just in the future and the future demand, but also what exists today, the assets that exist today that may be kind of stigmatized by most investors.
I mean, that gets into a very, a big debate that is raging out there right now, which is to how fast we need to make the energy transition. And is it sufficient to say, well, okay, this coal's slightly cleaner than the other one? Because if you've got a coal mine with great ESG, we might all die in a fiery
I completely agree, but this doesn't mean that you have to, within 2 years, cut it off. It's not going to happen like that. There can be regulation, there can be fiscal take, whatever the way is. Ticking the boxes. There needs to be a clear route to that transition, and then capital can allocate itself in an efficient manner around that. When there's uncertainty, when there are sudden changes in regulation, sudden changes in fiscal take, that's what unnerves investors. And we can have sudden shocks, exogenous shocks, endogenous shocks, whatever they may be, that can suddenly skew everything. And ultimately, who's been the one to, look at the last year, who's been the one to suffer? It's the end consumer, and in particular, it's been the Europeans. We may be complaining and saying, we can't, cost of living crisis, we can't go on holiday this year, type of thing. But it's not really us who are really suffering. It's actually the poorer economies who are suffering from this. So there is a level of sustainability and responsibility that we must take on as part of that energy transition to ensure that we actually do transition, not shock therapy, because shock therapy is not going to solve the problem.
So thanks. Nedbank has been aligned with the Equator Principles for over 15 years. It's really embedded in our culture and how we finance mining companies. So it's not new for us. And, we see mining and renewable energy, very much linked. You need to extract the energy minerals to provide renewable energy, and we need renewable energy to provide sustainable mining going forward. So at Nedbank, we've got a very strong mining team, we've got a very strong energy team, and we're working very closely with our teams internally to provide financings for these renewable energy solutions for our companies and our clients.
Yeah, I think also it's important to recognize that transition takes time. I think Germany depends on Ukraine and Russian gas is the example of close down the nuclear, close down the coal mines, and then be dependent on one source. It's very, very dangerous. So I think that there is much more opportunities for this industry to do ESG and sustainability and improve the operations you have today, rather than trying to make something complete new. Because the world need the energy, they need the metals and all these minerals today, and we have seen that China have taken control over a lot of these minerals. The big problem is really all the car manufacturers for battery minerals. They have invested in everything, but not upstream. I think that's where the biggest problem is. I think we did see the first really big car manufacturer outside Tesla moving with General Motors investing $650 million in Lithium Americas, which is still a developer company. And I do believe that we need to find, as mentioned by Philip and Glencore, we need to find all this money with big opportunities on return to build that industry that can supply this. And it's not going to happen tomorrow, it's going to happen over the next decade.
Now that you've seen General Motors investing in Lithium Americas, is that going to be the trigger for everyone else to pile in there? They've all been waiting for someone else to do something similar?
I remember we were sat here in May talking about it, and at that point in time, it was kind of I was getting a call every fortnight from an OEM saying, "Okay, how do we do this?" I actually went to go and visit GM in January, and I think that they're one of the more dynamic groups out there, and that is evidenced by this deal, $650 million in equity, securing offtake in the United States, but it's conditional upon permitting. It's still not permitted, right? We have a royalty on that Capas, and obviously I'm very, very hopeful that now the judge will be swayed by this investment decision, but it's still not permitted.
I mean, that goes back to the permitting question and that sort of NIMBYism that is holding mining projects back.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, Philip, just to take up from your point there, I think the problem that we have at the moment is on the demand side. I've also spoken to some of the OEMs, and they kind of say to us, well, how do we secure offtake? But if you look at the bottleneck of the battery metal space, and we own a rare earth business in Canada, and we're going to be supplying into the automotive industry, it's not actually, lots of people are building permanent magnets, battery manufacturing facilities, but actually the bottleneck is in the mining itself. And so the tragedy of the throat hold that process and regulation and stuff is putting on the industry is actually jeopardizing the future of electrification. And it's, going back to ESG, if you've ever built a mine before, as like many of everyone in this room has, it's your social license to operate is the most important thing, and it's something that we've done for decades. So ESG has become on the forefront of everyone's minds in the recent years. But the mining industry is one of the most audited industries globally. So I know manufacturing facilities which have far more deaths, and in the food industry, for example. So your social license to operate is the most important thing in mining, and that's part of our culture as miners. And it's something that as you built mines over the years, you eventually be the bottleneck to the electrification. And I think things have to change. Things have to get quicker if we want to support the demand. Otherwise, I don't know. The OEMs can keep coming downstream. They can keep buying assets. But if those assets don't get permitted and don't get funded, then there is no solution. These things have to get funded. They have to get permitted. They have to get into production.
Absolutely. I think that would be a good point to ask if there's any questions from our audience.
Thank you. I'm just thinking, in the West, obviously, a lot of policy is pretty emotionally driven, and the emotions against the oil industry actually affect the mining industry as well, even if it's for battery metals or whatever. A lot of people who drive the sentiment that drives the politicians sort of put mining and oil all into the same dirty bucket, so they don't really want a lot to do with it. And then pension funds and so forth all decide not to be involved in that dirty stuff because it's just too politically difficult. So that's what's happening. So do you see a big move as a source of capital outside of the West into, say, Saudi Arabia's got a new interest in mining at the moment, and Abu Dhabi and places like that. Are they going to be the ready sources of capital for this new development where those sort of Western pressures don't exist?
Look, I would say with that is we're already seeing it come full circle. I mean, in the last week, we saw the chief executive of BP come out and say, to your point about the oil industry, and say renewables isn't working for us. it's all the discussions all about energy security, and that suddenly forms part of the ESG story. So it's now back to energy security because the consumer is being hit. The returns in renewables are not there because you've had cost inflation, fixed price offtake generally on the renewables and cost inflation. So that's caused margin compression. So from what I'm seeing, we're already coming full circle where Western capital allocators, and in terms of corporate, are willing to now go back into increasing supply. We haven't yet seen it in thermal coal, but certainly on the crude side, we are definitely seeing that. And there is more and more of the discussion around what we're saying about higher quality coals, around effectively higher quality crude, so the type of crude and also the carbon intensity of pulling those barrels out of the ground, which varies substantially between kind of Permian to Norwegian North Sea, for example, are totally different. So from where I'm seeing it, we are starting to see that kind of come full circle. Generally the Americans have held, Chevron, Exxon, they've kind of held a strategy. They didn't change. It was the Shell, the Europeans, the Shell, BP, to the largest extent in oil, and Total to some extent. And again, I think we're moving on to thermal coal in a bit, but energy security has suddenly become an acceptable manner, and some of those ESG funds able to allocate even into kind of the dirtiest I'm always picking out is thermal coal because of energy security, and it's then allowed by their investors and by their regulators of their funds.
Yeah, it's a good question actually. I think that what we are seeing actually is that there are a number of asset managers out of Houston who have been involved in the oil and gas sector who are now transitioning away from oil and gas. And the next logical step is battery materials, energy transition stuff, and they're coming into our funds and indeed looking for co-investment. So what you have to remember here is that even investors like ourselves have our own investors, which are pension funds, in our case, like global pension funds. And to the point that Henry was making earlier, he's right. It is a transition, right? It is not a shock. And so he's right, there needs to be a transition. But actually, our LPs are saying is, you will not invest in a fossil fuel deal ever, right? That is a no, right? So actually, the tone from the top is, they want it to be a shock. The second point that you mentioned, which is around the Middle East, you're right. It's a frontier destination right now. They have recognized early that there needs to be a transition away from their oil-driven economies. They have always been an important LP of our organization, but right now that's where the money is. And so, we are looking to the Middle East to sort of fund our investments in the energy transition.
But I think also the question is very good, because we do see a lot of oil and gas companies that want to participate in the transition, but they are much more looking into wind farms and solar parks and so on, that they're looking into mining and batteries and so on. But to be honest, at least what we see, both on the equity side and on debt financing, particularly on the bond market, investors, they are willing to invest in the mining industry, also met coal. We've done 2 met coal deals relatively recently. But what we really struggle with is, again, that bank debt is not available for the mining industry. So I think the answer to your question is equity and commercial debt is there, but the policies in the banks, and I think it goes to the board level in all banks, that's the biggest hurdle at the moment for the industry.
Any other questions from the audience at this stage?
The only thing I'd add to that last question is that the African banks are supportive. So just as another source of capital, like a lot of if your projects are going back to Africa, seeing as we are here, like smaller projects, obviously, because they don't have the balance sheet of the international banks, but a lot of the African banks are supportive of the mining industry, so they're a good source of capital. But I do also agree the Saudis and the Middle East are very good, are very interested at the moment.
I would agree with that. I think that African banks are supportive of the sector, much more so than going out to North America and so on, and actually Cathy's team in particular. The thing I would say about African banks, though, is that there needs to be a graduation of thinking. In North America, there has been the concept of streaming and royalty and prepay and offtakes and all these funky structures that are actually quite crucial to getting things funded. It's difficult to get those things done in Africa because it's just a little bit earlier stage.
As we move forward, though, and look at sort of the impact that the energy transition can have on Africa, how much does the panelists sort of think that African countries need to be looking more sort of downstream and into the full supply chain, rather than being the sort of just source of raw materials?
Look, I think the difficulty for the large corporates investing in the mines and the downstream is with regards to margin. There's always the argument made that they don't want to go downstream because the margins aren't there. There's not much profit to be had in there, and they try and they have this argument. Free ports with Indonesia was the classic one with the very large issue that was over the last kind of 5 years, or it's been going for 10 years, let's say. But whenever there are these big projects or producing assets without the downstream there's this contention because the downstream requires billions of dollars of capex and the return on investment's pretty poor generally. The issue, and then they try and say to the local governments, hey, look, the tax take will not be so great. I kind of see it from a different perspective. If I'm a stakeholder in the government or an individual living near this mine, whatever the mine is may be, the kind of positive externalities, if you want to put it in that way, are so great of the downstream. So there are many employees generally in refineries. So yes, the profit margin might not be, or the total profit might not be that great, and the return on investment not so great. But it employs a lot of different people, a lot of support to those people, and therefore the positive impact of those countries is very strong. So there's that difficulty of the two kind of reconciling between kind of government, the different stakeholders, and generally it's not a positive thing for the big miners to get into, given just simply the return on capital, the return on investment of those investment projects. But from all the other different stakeholders involved, there are very significant benefits of doing so.
I mean, are there some lessons that African countries can learn from, say, Indonesia, who a few years ago, said no more exporting raw materials? It caused a big shock in certain commodities, but down the track, it's seen some benefits. Yeah, I mean, look, I would say price will determine it's a negotiation when you come in and you're having your license or your project, the negotiation with the government, whether it's producing or development assets. If it's of a significant size and the project is so high returning, you're willing as a mining company, obviously, to give up more to get that into production, or to continue producing, as it may be. So if you have a very high margin because the price is very high and the price expectation is very high situation, then you are more willing to kind of give up that capex into that liability, you may see it, and to sink more capex into it. And hence, obviously, why Freeport were willing to do that is because the returns still made a lot of sense, putting billions of dollars into the new refinery.
I think that Indonesia has been enormously successful in terms of cornering the nickel market. I think that's what you're referring to there. Does Africa want to emulate that? I think if I would ask myself the question, is it Indonesian or is it Chinese?
Well, there's I think a report investigation coming out, or in the works, looking at the LME situation.
But I think also we, as an audience here, should think really through, are you able to develop mines and produce metals and additionally making a chemical industry? Because if you're talking about this energy transition, you're talking about a chemical product which is highly complicated to make. And I think that it's rather better to focus on rather being a good miner or a good chemical company and work jointly instead of thinking about develop the same thing at the same time. We have seen multiple examples and across the panel here, miners that also is going to go downstream with processing facilities and so on, which really have made it very, very difficult to complete the transition to be delivering a chemical product to a cell manufacturer for EVs, for example. It's very, very difficult to be a chemical company when you're a miner or opposite.
And I think this goes back to my earlier point about Africa, is that for Africa to benefit from the downstream or the beneficiation process, we really need to get our infrastructure right and certainty of power, particularly baseload power right, before we can, participate in that value chain on the continent.
And in terms of getting baseload power, right, I'm sure, Henry, you've probably got some thoughts on what should be fueling that baseload power. But, I mean, yeah, jump in, John.
Look, the reality is that, it goes to, again, shock therapy versus transition. A lot of these countries, it's obviously the cheapest form of power has been thermal coal, that the infrastructure exists. Next year, you can't build, gas-fired power stations or intermittent wind and solar with battery storage. It's just too prohibitively expensive for them. So, look, there is a clear transition, but it's not going to be tomorrow. And during that period of time, to be very clear, there are great returns to be there for the investors. So, I'm not saying let's go and build new coal mines. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm just saying there are producing coal mines out there. The valuations are extremely attractive, and it means that our investors can get a return on that. It's not capital going into new supply that's aiding, climate change in any sort of way.
Any more questions from the audience? Well, in front here.
Hi, can I just ask your views on China? You mentioned China a moment ago, and whether their influence and stranglehold, I guess, on assets, on country debt, on processing, etc., is in any way kind of diminishing now with their lower cost base because they don't worry about ESG so much as the rest of the world.
So I would say that China is, the most important factor of any mining investor. We are all long China, right? So it's a really interesting dynamic, particularly as it pertains to the energy transition, right? Because there are certain commodities that we actually don't know what we're doing, right? So rare earths is the classic, but it also extends into lithium. It also extends into graphite. And in some of these commodities, we are, in my view, on a knife edge. We could have a situation in a couple of years in rare earths where China will not export any processed rare earths whatsoever or permanent magnets. Not to frustrate the West, not to to hurt the West, actually because it needs it for its own domestic needs, right? Its own domestic economy. And so it's a hugely important dynamic, I think, as an investor that one has to take account of.
You make an interesting point about withholding rare earths and magnets and things. If China did invade Taiwan, and then obviously it's the same situation as with Russian gas and Ukraine, do you think the impact on the West would be even greater if China was to deliberately withhold strategic metals from the West? Would that be greater than what we've seen with Russian gas in the Ukrainian conflict?
So that's an extremely hard question to answer. It would be similar, I think, is the answer.
But just to answer your question about the costing that you said, that is also an issue. Is that while China is responsible for a lot of the demand, they also can produce things because they have different regulatory administration. So it does make it harder for the global industry to compete on pricing.
But I mean, Philip's question there about invading Taiwan, the threat of that has caused, a big sort of urgency to build new silicon manufacturing facilities in the United States. Obviously, China's that perceived threat, potential threat there. I should choose my words carefully as a resident of Hong Kong, but that perceived issue there. That is spurring on a lot of new investment, though, in the EU or America.
Yes, it is, but it's all downstream, right? There's not enough upstream. That's the point, right? It's raw materials. That's the problem right now.
Yeah, I agree. That's the bottleneck.
It's investment in raw materials and access to it. But as miners, we should all keep in mind that there is one client of all this that drive everything is China. So it goes from met coal, it goes to iron ore, it goes to everything. It's China that is the big client to take off most of it. Yes, it's go back to the OECD countries as a finished product, steel, stainless steel, and so on. But it's still sort of China that is the big client of the mining industry. And the limitation is access or extraction of the raw material. and we don't see those investments, as Philip says.
I mean, everyone's mentioned that two things, that the processing of these minerals is very hard, but also that China is doing it really well. What is it that is so clever about the Chinese or the Chinese education system that has allowed them to completely beat us on this? Us, when I say us, I mean Europe and America.
Two things: lower environmental standards and unlimited state capital.
Is that just an excuse, though, now?
I don't think it's an excuse. I think that everyone should read the book that is mentioned in the rare metal war. It is really the flip side of our ESG that have been driving this over to China, which have much lower standards, and taken and paid that bill in country.
What is the book?
The rare metal war.
So we've got just a couple of minutes left. Have you got any final questions for our panellists? We do. We've got yeah.
Hello. I can't help thinking that everybody's oversimplifying this sort of decarbonisation, that we've got 170,000 terawatts of global energy burning in transport, industrial heat, of which only 16% is electricity. And all we're making is actually empty petrol tanks with the EVs, because except you're swapping them with 9 kilos of steel to 300 kilos of material, but it's empty. And so you need electricity. And the renewables are not going to do that. So electricity has to grow to probably 80,000 terawatts. In the last 5 years, on a global scale, renewables are only 3% of the contribution. And it's all well and good saying, oh, we're going to knock out fossil, and I don't like it. But there are projections that by the end of this century, it'll still be 50 to 60% fossil fuels will be on this planet. And as long as people don't face that reality, you can't design a solution. Over.
I would say, it rings true to what I had said. And that's why, I think, look, the returns in the renewable space, you're getting LIBOR plus 5%. Returns in the old fossil fuels, you're getting LIBOR plus 15%. Plus you're getting the warrants to the upside. So your returns are just so much higher, and exactly to your point, that it's got to sustain for those that period. So, where do you want to put your money during that period? There are returns. You have the choice. You can be part of that, bringing on new supply in the new world where it will have its problems, and there are a lot of risks around that, the construction risks, all the rest of it. Or you can get kind of higher headline returns in what I would argue are lower risk producing assets.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion, and we've covered a whole range of topics there, and we could talk all day, but unfortunately we've run out of time with 3 seconds on the clock. So can I just have a big round of applause for our panellists? Thank you very much.